Hey guys, tonight we begin with the slow ripple of something no one wanted to touch. Not water, not exactly, but a dark slick of something heavier, slipping from a stone chute just beneath the castle wall. It shimmered under the moonlight in a way that suggested movement. And smell.so before you get comfortable. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Because somewhere just out of torchlight, beneath the drawbridge or beyond the herb garden, someone was waiting with a bucket, a thick-gloved hand, a quiet breath held behind cloth that not every part of medieval life made it into the paintings. There were no ballads sung for the ones who walked toward the stench when everyone else turned away, but they were there. Before sunrise, after supper, when the nobles forgot their food, had to go somewhere, and when the privies filled faster than the river could carry things off. This isn't a story about glory or armor or names carved into the stone. It's about shadows, about damp wool and rusted tools, about the people who cleaned, who carried, who emptied the things no one wanted to look at, even when their work kept the whole place livable. Because history doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It crouches in corners. It digs a trench. It holds its breath and keeps going out. So if you're still with me, draw the blanket a little tighter. Let your breathing slow. Because this story isn't about kings or glory. It's about what happens below, where the waste went. And who dealt with it? The city didn't breathe like we do. It wheezed. Thick with smoke and steam and something sour that clung to your nose and followed you home. The alleyways were never truly empty, not of people, not of cats, not of puddles, especially not of puddles. Some puddles were rain. Most weren't. The houses leaned in on each other like gossiping neighbors, their wooden beams warped from damp and time. Their upper stories swelled outward, narrowing the streets below into dark, dribbling ravines. This was where it all gathered. Not just the people, not just the stories, but everything left behind when a story finished. And what no one talks about is that it didn't feel dramatic. It felt normal. To step out the front door and pour a chamber pot onto the cobbles, to dodge the splatter with your boots, to hear it land with a wet slap and pretend it didn't. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. No one asked where it went, because someone always came for it. Not in daylight, not in parades, but late and slow and steady, a rhythm as ancient as hunger. He came with a cart, wheels that creaked under the weight, two handles worn smooth by hands that didn't ask for thanks, a shovel, though it didn't help much in the wet season, and a sack of something straw, maybe, or just old cloth, to tie around his face when it got particularly bad. He had no title, no badge, no guild to protect him, but every street knew his name, or at least the sound of his boots. He didn't speak often. What was there to say? Good evening felt out of place when hauling human waste. So he nodded. He worked. He moved like smoke and disappeared before dawn. There was dignity in that. Not the kind you read about in books, but the quieter kind. The kind you earn when your hands do what others won't. The kind that smells, but still matters. Children learned early to get out of his way. Dogs didn't bark at him. Cats didn't run. Even the flies seemed to hum a different tune when he passed out. In some homes, they left bread for him on the step. Stale, but still warm. A quiet thank you with no eye contact, no words. Just a crust broken in the dark. And in the summer months, when the smell thickened to something that felt alive, he moved faster. Not out of haste, but mercy. Because every moment wasted was one more breath someone else had to take. The work never ran out. There were always more buckets, more corners, More unseen piles behind taverns and bakeries and church walls. The waste of prayer and pleasure alike. And yet he was not poor. Not truly. Because while no one spoke to him in daylight, everyone needed him by night. And coin, like sewage, flowed downhill. He kept to himself. Lived near the edge of town. A shack with a sloped roof and a door that stuck in the rain. Inside, he had a stool, a cot, and a coat that hung heavy with everything it had absorbed. He washed when he could. He didn't pretend to be clean, but he never let filth settle on his soul. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the stars showed through the soot and the world held its breath between storms, he'd pause, lean on his cart, look up, and feel, for a moment, not like a man buried under everyone else's waste, but like the one who kept it all from drowning. He didn't ask for better, because better often came with obligations, and noise, and people who talked too much and cleaned too little. He understood the value of silence. He understood how important it was that no one noticed him, because that meant he was doing it right. But sometimes, just sometimes, he wished for a name. Not shouted, not sung, just whispered. Remembered. And in the spring, when the rains came heavy and the waste pits filled fast, the city noticed him more. They didn't say so, but they looked out windows when he passed. They closed doors behind him softly, instead of slamming them. They gave their children his path to sweep, and though he never said it out loud, he noticed that too. Because in a world where most things were temporary, roofs, roads, even lives, his work stayed. Rotten, yes. Repulsive, sure. But necessary. And under all the layers of cloth, of stink, of solitude, there was something close to pride. Because when you carry the weight, no one else will. You learn to stand straighter, even if no one sees it in the dark. And so the smell settled into the streets, into the wood, into the folds of cloth and under fingernails, into memory. Not because it was loved, but because it was lived. And that brings us to someone else, someone who didn't clean the streets, but the castle, where even the nobles had needs. And someone, always someone, had to deal with what they left behind. We'll go there next. The streets were quiet, but not empty. Not entirely. Somewhere between midnight and morning, before the cocks crowed, and long before bread was baked, a different kind of procession moved through the alleys. Wooden wheels, rusted metal rims, sloshing, uneven loads. Not wine, not water, but something thicker, darker. Older. This was the night soil route. Not a road marked on any map, not a trail sung in stories, but it existed, known by smell more than sight, known by the sound of a slow push, a grunt, a wooden cart shifting its weight against cobblestones, still damp from the evening's offerings. There were men who took this road, not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. The city didn't pause to thank them, and they didn't ask it to. They came when the shutters were closed and the candles had burned to their final flickers. They knocked only once, and only if a bucket hadn't been left out. They didn't linger. Each stop was short, rhythmic, like the beat of a heart no one notices, until it stops. One hand on the cart, one hand wrapped in cloth, a shoulder bent from years of hauling other people's weight. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore layers, old tunics, thick belts, aprons made from stitched leather and waxed canvas, all soaked through with years of quiet labor. They didn't talk much, not to each other, not to anyone. A nod was plenty, a shared look sometimes. That was enough. They moved like smoke, and when they passed, the dogs didn't bark. The cats, always watching, blinked slowly, then turned away. Their cargo was foul, yes, but the way they carried it. There was a kind of grace, a rhythm, a knowledge of balance, of how to lean into the cart just enough, of when to brace, when to lift, when to let gravity do what gravity would, because a spilled bucket didn't just mean more work. It meant shame, smell, memories that lingered longer than they should dot, so they didn't spill, even on the narrowest turns, even when frost slicked the stones and the wind bit through every seam in their clothes. They held steady. There were routes that twisted behind bakeries, past stables, under low arches, and through cellars. The city had holes no one else remembered, passages left behind by older builders. And they knew them all, not from maps, from doing dots sometimes when the moon was high and clear and the world held its breath. The whole route shimmered like a silver scar through the city's underbelly. And they walked it in silence, because to speak was to stir the air. And on some nights, the air was thick enough already. Their reward wasn't praise. It was coin tucked into cloth. And sometimes a fresh pair of gloves. Sometimes not, but the job paid better than most expected, because filth, it turned out, was profitable, if you could stomach it. Some of them had families. A wife who waited up with water heating on the hearth. A child who slept through the creak of the door. A home with herbs strung above the windows and vinegar boiling on the stove, not for food, but for smell. Others lived alone. A room behind a stable, or a shack near the edge of the woods, where no one minded what followed them home. And even among themselves, there were ranks. Old hands who knew every shortcut, new ones who hadn't yet learned to breathe through the mouth, and always one who disappeared after a winter, too sick or too shamed, or just too tired. They didn't ask where he went. They just passed, his gloves down, if they were still good, and they kept walking, because the city didn't pause, because people still ate, and what goes in must go out. Their work ended with the dawn. Carts emptied at the edge of town, not dumped, collected, for farmers who knew its worth, for fields that needed fertilizing, because even the foulest things have a purpose, if you know how to use them. They washed, if they had time. They slept, if they could. And when the city woke, fresh bread, warm streets, gossip already swirling, they were gone. No one thanked them. But no one questioned why the streets didn't stink quite as badly as they might have. And sometimes, as they walked the last stretch home, a raven would croak from the rooftops, watching, not judging because in the world of scavengers, the line between noble and necessary was always blurred. And beneath all the layers of cloth, of routine, of waste, they carried a strange kind of pride, not loud, but settled deep, because they knew what they carried, and they knew how not to let it spill. No one lit torches for them. No one sang, but the streets somehow stayed passable. And in a world held together by those who cleaned behind the scenes, that was enough. No one built monuments to the men who took the night soil route. But if you knew where to look, in the smooth grooves of old cobblestones, in the curve of alley walls worn from carts just wide enough to fit, you could trace their path, a history written in silence and carried before dawn. And that brings us to another kind of cleaner, not on the streets, but within stone walls, behind doors thick with tapestry, inside the castle itself. Someone, after all, had to clean for royalty. Let's step through the side door, where the torchlight flickers, and the smell is softer, but not by much. The rain didn't fall softly. It fell like it meant it, heavy, hurried, and relentless, as if the sky was trying to wash away everything it saw. But the streets weren't built for cleansing. They were narrow, packed, uneven, a patchwork of stone and dirt and wishful thinking where the water didn't flow so much as collect, in dips, in cracks, in the footprints of people too tired to lift their heels. They said it was mud, but everyone knew better, because when the skies opened, what ran between the cobbles wasn't just rain and soil. It was the week's waste, piss, rot, refuse, bits of bone, onion peels, soot, and things no one wanted to name. The alleys swelled with it. Not quickly, but surely. A slow rising tide of grime that crept ankle-high, then deeper. Brown, gray, green. A palette no painter would choose, but one every peasant knew. And still, they walked through it not because they wanted to. Because they had to. The baker had bread to sell. The midwife had births to attend. The apprentice had to fetch more nails. No one paused for puddles. No matter what floated in them dot boots were a luxury. Most had shoes. Some had none. The lucky ones stuffed straw between their toes. The clever ones wrapped cloth and prayed it held. The desperate stepped where others stepped and hoped the path stayed firm. But the truth was, nothing stayed firm. For long, streets churned underfoot. Each step pulled back just slightly, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let go. And the smell rose with the steam. A wet, clinging scent that wrapped around your throat and didn't let go until morning that it wasn't uncommon to lose something in it. A shoe, a hope. Occasionally, a small pig, swallowed by a sudden sinkhole, squealing into the filth like a warning no one could decipher in time. No one mourned the pig. But they did mention it, over stew, in silence, because in a place where waste lived openly, every footstep was an act of quiet bravery. There were tricks, of course, raised wooden walkways built by those with coin, but they were narrow, jealously, guarded and slick when wet. One wrong step and you weren't just in the street, you were part of it. Children learned fast. Step lightly. Never run. Always check with a stick if you're unsure what's beneath that shiny patch near the tavern. And never, ever fall. Because the street didn't just stain. It swallowed, not with speed. With patience. With certainty. It filled the seams of your clothes, crept up your legs, lingered in the hem of your tunic long after you'd made it home. And even after scrubbing, some smells stayed, embedded in thread, woven into wool, a reminder of where you'd been, and what you'd survived. Laundry, such as it was, didn't do much. Soap was rare, water was cold, and no one wanted to be the one who boiled a garment only to find the stink. Rising anew at the steam. So they layered. Shirts over tunics, aprons over everything, not to stay dry, just to keep the worst from sinking too deep. And somehow, life carried on. They laughed sometimes, at the ridiculousness of it all, at the way old Thomas lost a boot again and tied a turnip to his foot instead, at how children made boats from broken spoons and watched them sail down alley currents with quiet awe. There was resilience in that, a strange kind of joy, even in filth, because when everything around you stank, a good joke was golden. A warm fire was a miracle, and a dry corner of a bed meant you'd made it. Visitors from other towns often looked horrified. Some turned back. Others tried to tiptoe through. Lifting their robes like that would save them. Locals didn't bother. They walked like they meant it, straight through, heads up, nostrils flared, because they understood it wasn't just mud. It was the city's memory, its leftovers, its proof of living. Every drop came from somewhere, from someone. And so, each step carried a kind of intimacy, a closeness no one asked for, but everyone shared. And when the rains finally stopped, the sun came out as if it had done nothing wrong, drying the worst of it into a thin, cracking crust that flaked underfoot, swept into corners, pressed into wood, forgotten until the next storm. But some things weren't forgotten. There were those who worked the streets after the rain, with shovels, with barrels, with stomachs stronger than most. They knew what waited in the puddles. And they came, anyway, because someone had to clean what remained. And it wasn't just about keeping the roads walkable. It was about making the city livable. Barely, but still. And that brings us closer to the places most never saw. The inner walls of the castles, the silent corners of noble halls, where the mess didn't flow outward, but downward, through stone shafts and secret chutes. And someone, always someone, had to go below. Let's follow them there. There were rooms in the castle no one spoke of. Rooms with thick stone walls, narrow doors, and a single purpose. Rooms with no windows. Only a hole. They were tucked away in towers, behind tapestries, beside the bedchambers of those who never lifted their own chamber pots. Quiet, dark spaces, where waste fell from height, sometimes landing in straw, sometimes not. They called them garderobes, a word that sounded elegant. But elegance ends when the smell begins, and while kings dined and lords debated, while the embroidered sleeves of courtly gowns swept across polished floors, someone had already been there, already scrubbed the edges, already emptied the pails, already lit a bundle of herbs, hoping the scent might linger longer than the stench dot. Her name was not remembered. None of theirs were, but the privy maids knew every crack in the stone, every quirk in the flow, every bucket that leaked a little more each week. They moved early, before the castle stirred, and late, after the fires had burned low. Not because they were slow, but because their work began when everyone else's ended. They didn't wear fine cloth. Their aprons were thick with layers of old wax and new grime. Their hands red from lye, their eyes tired from squinting by torchhole, and yet they moved like shadows. Not creeping, gliding, as if the castle had learned to accommodate their steps. They weren't spoken to, not unless scolded, but they heard everything, every secret spilled by noble mouths as they sat above, every half-whispered confession, left in the chamber air, every nervous footstep leading to a door no one liked to admit using. The walls held echoes, and the privy maids listened not for gossip, but for timing. Because cleaning wasn't just about scraping and scrubbing. It was about knowing when no one would walk in, when you wouldn't be seen, or worse, smelled. There was danger. 2. One wrong move and the stone ladder could slip beneath your feet. One false bucket and the contents could splash instead of pour. One poorly tied kerchief and your nose would pay the price for hours. They had tricks. Salt beneath the nostrils, mint chewed before entering, vinegar rags tied behind the ears. Not perfect, but enough and they had pride. The quiet kind. Not in the work itself, but in how well it was done. No one ever said, "Thank you." But if no one gagged, if no one noticed, that was reward enough. Sometimes they found things. Coins, trinkets, rings that had slipped free of careless fingers. They never kept them, not because they feared punishment, but because they knew to be trusted was rarer than to be rich, and they were trusted in their own way. The castle didn't run without them. It only pretended to, because a feast brings waste, a wedding, a coronation, even a birth, all end the same, with someone cleaning what's left behind. And the privy maids understood that better than most. They were often older, widows, women whose hands had rocked cradles and now held scrubbing stones, women who whispered prayers while they worked, not for grace, but for strength. Younger girls joined sometimes, blushing, hesitating, then learning fast that modesty has no place in a privy. They became strong, not just in muscle, in silence. In endurance, they learned how to brace their knees against slick stone, how to tie their sleeves tight, how to wash their arms without soap, and they learned how to breathe shallow, a talent rarely appreciated. Until it's needed, they were ghosts in a world of silks and steel, unseen, but everywhere. And when the nobles complained of a faint smell, a lingering stain, they didn't argue. They nodded and fixed it, even if it wasn't theirs, because they understood the unspoken rule. Their failure was visible. Their success? Invisible. That was the job. And at night, when their shift was done, they sat beside the kitchens or in corners near the fire, hands red, eyes closed, bowels still churning from the day's breath. They didn't speak of their work, because no one wanted to hear it. And maybe, after so long, they didn't want to say it. But they knew each other, by gait, by scent, by the way their hands moved even at rest, scrubbing in circles, out of habit. Some had humor. Soft laughter over spilt pails and near misses. A shared joke about the Lord's favorite chair. Quiet glee when a rat took a noble by surprise. Small things. But they mattered. Because in a place where gold shimmered and voices rose in song, someone had to kneel. Someone had to clear what royalty left behind. Someone had to see the castle not as a dream, but as a machine. One that leaked and stank, and always needed scrubbing. And so they did. Not because they loved it, but because it was theirs. They belonged to the castle, and the castle, in its strange, thankless way, belonged to them. And that brings us lower still, not in rank, in level. Because beneath the castle, beneath the stone, beyond the walls, something else waited, something still and foul, an ancient. Where bathwater pooled and turned black, and someone again had to wade in. Let's follow the pipe. Down. At first, it sounded like peace, a splash, a sigh, the hush of steam rising from a tub that had seen better wood and worse water. Bathing in the medieval world was often a community affair, a ritual, a shared silence that pretended to be cleansing. But not all peace is clean, and not all water is holy, because what filled those tubs wasn't fresh from a spring. It came from wells too close to waste pits, from rivers that carried both blessing and bile, drawn bucket by bucket, warmed over open flame, and poured into wooden basins too large to scrub and too old to seal. The bathhouse was warm, yes, but it was never clean. And when the last bather stepped out, wringing sweat and soap from their limbs, the water stayed, thick, still, lined with oils, flakes of skin, strands of hair, an echo of every person who came before. The job of emptying. It fell to someone else, not the bather. Never the bather. She came with a pail, notched from years of use, and a cloth tied over her nose, though it did little good. By the time she arrived, the bathwater had turned from clear to gray, from gray to brown, from brown to something that shimmered under torchlight like a secret better left unspoken. It wasn't just water anymore. It was a stew of sweat, of soap, of silence and the slow churn of other people's lives. If the fire had gone out, it steamed less. If it lingered, the mist clung to her clothes. And even in summer, the chill in that room clung to her spine. She didn't empty it all at once. There was a method, a rhythm, a pail lowered, a scoop taken, a lift, careful, always careful. Because if it sloshed, it spilled. And if it spilled, it stayed, in cracks, in wood grain, in shoes. She dumped it into a trough that led outside, sometimes to a field, sometimes nowhere. Sometimes, if no one was watching, into the alley, not because she didn't care, but because the water didn't end. No matter how much she carried, there was always more. The bottom of the tub was the worst, where oils had settled, where hair clumped and soap scummed and things you didn't want to name collected. She scrubbed that part. with a brick. No brush could hold up. No cloth was coarse enough. She used her hands, too. When she had to, the smell followed her home. Soaked into her sleeves, her skin, her hair, she stopped noticing after a while. Others didn't dot at market. People stepped. Back, on feast days, no one stood beside her. In church, she sat near the back, but she didn't mind much, because she knew something they didn't. She saw them without clothes, without perfume, without pretense. She knew what they left behind, what washed off and what didn't. And sometimes she knew more. Rashes that weren't spoken of, bruises that didn't come from work, scars that told stories no one else asked to hear. She never told, but she remembered, not as gossip, as truth, because she dealt with the water, and the water carried it all. When sickness came, they blamed the air, the stars, the season, but she knew. The bathwater had turned black long before the coughing started. She said nothing. No one would listen, but she boiled her clothes, scrubbed her nails, stayed home when others gathered, and she watched them fall, one by one, the same ones who turned away from her in the square, the same ones who soaked in her bath and left without a glance. She didn't smile, but she understood. There was power in dirt and in knowing how to clean it. When winter came, the bathhouse was colder. The steam froze on the walls. The tubs cracked. But still, people came, because even in the cold, they wanted warmth. Even in the dark, they wanted to be washed. And she waited, with her pail, with her cloth, with her quiet knowledge of what they would leave behind. Sometimes, when the fire was high and the room was empty, she'd sit beside the tub. Not close, not touching, just near enough to feel the heat, to hear the drip, to watch the surface settle. And in that stillness she thought of the lives that passed through this place, of the things that clung to skin, of the burdens they washed off, and who bore them next, because someone always bore them. Not the water, the hands that emptied it. And that brings us to the next space. Not a room, but a pit. A hole that didn't just receive waste, but held it, grew things in it, took things from it. Let's step carefully. The edge is slick. And what lives there is not always what you'd expect. It didn't start as a place for the living. Not really. It was a hole, first, dug behind the bakery, beside the butcher's stall, beneath the corner where 3 streets leaned into each other. Like tired men at dusk. It wasn't deep, at first. Just enough to take what no one wanted. Peels, bones, blood. Waste from chamber pots. Water blackened from too many meals, too many hands. And then it grew, not by design, by habit. Because once a pit is made, people forget how to stop filling it. It grew wider. It grew darker. It became a place people didn't look at. They walked past it with their eyes forward. They whispered to children to mind the edge. They threw things in without checking first. And slowly, it came to life. The flies came first. Clouds of them, buzzing, endless, dancing in spirals. Over the surface like they were praising it. They landed on bread, on cheeks, on cuts that hadn't healed. People swatted, but never near the pit. As if to disturb, it was to invite something worse. Then came the frogs. Drawn by the damp, by the stillness, they croaked from the rim, laid eggs in the water, slipped silently between the garbage. Children said they whispered. Said the frogs spoke in voices like old women, warning, waiting, watching. Adults didn't believe it, but they avoided the pit just the same. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, you could hear things moving, plopping, sliding, breathing, maybe, or something like it. No one ever checked, because the pit didn't just hold waste, it held memory. of what the town wanted gone, of what it refused to face, and in time it gained a reputation. A goat disappeared. A toddler nearly fell in. Once, a man claimed to have dropped his key and climbed down to find it, but he never came back the same. He didn't speak of what he saw, only stopped drinking, stopped sleeping indoors, started carrying salt in both hands. The baker said it was nonsense. The priest said it was sin, but the pit said nothing, and it didn't have to, because its silence was already full of rot, of echo, of things too soft to be bone and too sharp to be stick. Once a year, someone was hired to clean it. They brought ropes, torches, buckets tied to longer ropes. They lasted an hour. Maybe 2. Then they'd emerge pale, shaking, clothes ruined, saying little except that it was done. But it was never done, because waste doesn't leave. It layers, like years, like regrets, like secrets. In winter, the pit froze, steam curling, up through cracks. A quiet reminder that even when silent, it was not still. In summer, it hissed, it bubbled, it grew strange colors, greens that glowed, blues that shimmered, blacks that felt too deep. And still, people threw things in. Old shoes, dead hens, letters not meant to be read. It was a kind of forgetting, a ritual, a release, but not everything. That went in stayed gone. Cats dragged bones back out. Dogs fell ill from licking the edge. Once, someone found a necklace, still shining, still warm. They didn't wear it. They buried it. Some said the pit was cursed. Some said it was alive. Most just said it was necessary, because when a town has no sewer, it finds somewhere else to hide itself. And the pit, for all its horrors, asked nothing. It just took. And in return, it kept the town clean, or cleaner, clean enough. Until it rained. And then it rose, slowly, steadily, slicking the rim, spilling its edge, letting out a little of what it had swallowed. People stayed indoors. They stuffed cloth beneath their doors, burned sage, prayed. Because no one wanted to see what floated up. Sometimes it was just cabbage. Sometimes it was worse. And once it was a hand, not fresh, not whole. Just a hand, wearing a ring that no one claimed. It was buried. No questions asked, because the pit didn't give answers, only reminders of how fragile the line is between what we throw away and what we become. So they kept digging new ones. When the old filled, when the ground grew too soft to hold more. Pits, new places to forget. And the old ones, covered with boards, with stones, with silence. Built over, lived upon. And sometimes years later, someone would dig a garden and find something unexpected. A bone, a buckle, a smell, and they'd stop, look around, then fill the hole, and plant something else. Because forgetting is easier than remembering. But the ground always remembers. And that brings us finally to the air. To the smell that clung to every wall, every robe, every breath. To the thing no one could see, but everyone carried. Let's follow it into the streets, into the lungs, into the lives of those who never asked for it, but lived inside it all the same. It arrived before the cart, before the voice, before the footstep that made the floor creak. It was in the air, heavy, sour, clinging. It wrapped around you like a memory you didn't ask for. The smell, not just one, not just rot or sweat or smoke, but a symphony of decay. Dung from the street, grease from the tavern, mold from the corner of the thatched roof that never dried, a hint of vinegar, a whisper of sickness, a full-bodied stench of life packed too tightly, lived too hard. You didn't notice it right away, because you were part of it. You were born into it, swaddled in it. Rocked to sleep beside it, it soaked into your wool, your fingernails, your teeth. Even clean water had its scent, metallic, mossy, warmed by sun or spoiled by stillness. And those who smelled different? They stood out. A foreign merchant with cloves tucked in his sleeves. A bishop reeking of incense and polished. Wood, a noble woman with rose oil behind each ear, so strong it made you dizzy. They called it rank, not as insult. As category. Everyone had one. You knew the blacksmith by the iron tang on his coat, the tanner by the reek of urine and lime, the baker by the sweet scorch of crust and ash, the midwife by the blood. Smell told stories, more honest than names, and some tried to fight it. Bundles of herbs hung over doorways, dried lavender and rosemary, crushed underfoot, garlic braided in windows like holy symbols. Bathing helped for a moment, but water was scarce, and soap, when found, was rough on skin and harsher on pride. They burned things. Pine resin, myrtle, old parchment soaked and scented, oil, but the smoke only blurred the edges, because the smell always returned. From the streets, from the walls, from under your nails. No matter how hard you scrub it, it was worse in the summer. Heat stirred it, made it bolder. And sweat gave it wings. Windows, when they existed, stayed open. Not for light, for escape. To give the sense somewhere to go. It didn't. It lingered. In churches. Even the air of prayer held it. Mingled with incense, it became something else. Something holy, but faintly rotten. In bedrooms, it grew soft. Not gentler, just tired. Pressed into pillows, woven into blankets that were never truly dry, shared between bodies that rarely washed, but still found comfort in warmth. And yet, they lived, they laughed, they sang. They kissed. Because survival teaches you to stop noticing. It teaches you to breathe shallow when you must, to swallow down. The gag reflex. To let the smell of waste become the smell of home. And some even found love in it. A woman with hands that smelled of onions and soapstone. A man with hair that held smoke like memory. Children who ran through the market trailing. Fish scales and muddy joy. It became familiar. Not pleasant, but known. And sometimes, that's enough. The worst smells were the ones you didn't expect. A sudden sweetness from spoiled milk. A floral scent masking infection. The sharp, clean edge that meant someone had burned too much lye, trying to scrub the past away. Those were the ones that made people pause, look closer, hold their breath, because not all filth was obvious, and not all rot wore its face up front. But the daily stench, the shared one, that was communal. A city-wide baptism. A blanket none could shake off. Even the rich weren't safe. They had perfumes, yes. Spices, yes. But their chamber pots smelled the same. Their servants sweated just as hard. Their dogs left messes in the same halls. You could trace a noble by his scent, but not for long. Because the moment he stepped outside, he joined the rest. Smothered by the same thick tapestry of life, unwashed and undeniable. And in the end, it was the poor who adapted best, who learned to read a room by its air. Who could tell you what kind of illness had passed through a house by the scent on the floorboards? Who knew which alley to walk, which stall to avoid, which fire burned clean, and which DIDN single quotes T. It was knowledge, hard-earned, unspoken. A survival instinct you never wrote down. Only passed on. From mothers wiping noses to grandmothers boiling sage. From fathers scrubbing boots to children holding their breath when emptying a bucket. And yes, it wore on them. There were days when they longed for clean, for something fresh, for wind that carried nothing but itself. But those were rare, and mostly in dreams, because this was life, rank and real. Lived not despite the smell, but inside it dot. And if you ever walked into town and smelled nothing, you'd worry, because the only place without smell was the graveyard. And even there, the earth remembered Dot, and so we turn now to the flame, to the warmth that was never quite warm enough, to the fire that fought off more than cold. It battled the scent, the silence, the slow crawl of night. Let's step toward it, because soon the waste will freeze, and nothing smells sharper than things. Filth turned to Frost Dot. It sounds like a joke, like something whispered in the tavern just before the ale takes hold. But it wasn't. Toilets caught fire. Not once. Not as myth. Often enough that people stopped laughing, Dot, because when you build everything from timber and thatch and fill every gap with straw to keep the wind out, you create more than warmth. Dot, you create fuel. Dot, now add the privy. A little room at the back of the house. A seat over a hole. Some hay to wipe with, maybe. And if you're lucky, a smoldering coal to keep the frost away, because no one wants to freeze mid-squat. They'd tuck a brazier beneath the bench. Just a few embers. Just enough to keep the cold from biting too hard. But fire has no patience. And waste, it turns out, is surprisingly flammable when soaked into dry boards and layered with time. Dot, no one knew the exact moment it happened. One moment, a family was settling in for the night. Bowls scraped clean, shutters barred, the dog curled by the fire. The next, someone smelled smoke. Not the good kind. Not the kind from stew or soap or pine. This was sharp, acrid, laced with something worse. Dot, and by the time they reached the back of the house, it was too late. Dot, the privy glowed. Not golden, orange like anger, with sparks licking up the wall and smoke crawling into the thatch. Dot, they shouted. Through water. Beat it with cloaks and prayer, but the wind carried it, and the neighbors hadn't been careful either. One privy fire became 2, then 10. Dot, and in an hour, the entire block was lit. Dot, not by war, not by lightning, by filth and ember, and the quiet assumption that warmth wouldn't betray you. Whole towns went up this way. Not cities, but hamlets. Villages where homes pressed against each other like frightened animals, sharing heat and risk. Some blamed the devil. Some blamed fate. But the wise knew better. Dot, it was a bucket left too near the coals. A child who kicked a lantern. A log that popped just wrong and sent sparks behind the privy door. Because when everything's dry, it only takes one. Afterward, they sifted the ash. Dot, found pots fused with iron, bones too small to name. The ghost of a home. Chimney still standing, like it was waiting for soup. Dot, and always the stink, because not even fire could burn that out. The smell of what had been beneath the seat lingered in the ruins, as if to say, this was where it started. Some rebuilt, with stone when they could, but most just cleared the rubble and built again. Wood on wood, straw on straw, because what else could they do? They couldn't stop going, and they couldn't do it in the cold. Dot, so they tried to be careful. Hung buckets nearby, banned candles. From the outhouse, said little prayers before sitting down. But memory is short, and winter long. Dot, and when your toes go numb, a little heat seems worth the risk. The irony was never lost. The fire was supposed to protect them. From the chill, from sickness, from frostbite and locked joints and breath that smoked like chimney flue. Instead, it betrayed them. At the worst possible moment, that it reminded them that everything they needed, warmth, relief, silence, could also undo them. Dot, so they adjusted. Dot, put chimneys in the roof, if they could. Built the privy further from the house, if there was room. Lined the pit with stone, if they had the coin. But not everyone had coin. Dot, so most just hoped. They watched the flames dance in their brazier, listened to the creak of the boards, and prayed softly that this night wouldn't be the one. The town criers told the stories. Another fire. Started in the back. Privy blaze took. 6 homes. People nodded. Then moved on. Because when the smell of smoke is just part of the street, you stop wondering where it came from. Children asked why the air tasted sharp, why the moon looked blurry, why their favorite chair now lived in a pile of ash beside the chicken coop. Parents gave no answers, just handed them water and told them to stay away from the back door. And if someone didn't rebuild, if a family disappeared, they weren't spoken of, just missed, quietly, like a meal forgotten on the stove. Because in a town made of kindling, mourning is too risky. It draws attention, and attention draws sparks. So they lived on, careful, hopeful, silent. Knowing the next fire might come not from war, but from the simplest need, a little warmth, a little relief, a little too close to what burns. And that brings us to the fields, to where the waste went next, to the open country, where the smell changed, but didn't disappear, because nothing in this story truly disappears. Especially not when it's buried. They didn't call it a toilet. There was no word for luxury out here, just a pit, a hole dug in haste and hope. Hope that it would last the season. Hope that the rains wouldn't rise too soon. Behind the cottage, past the woodpile, where nettles grew tall and no one lingered, that's where they put it. Each family had their own, though none marked it with pride. It was understood, like hunger, like silence. The peasant's pit was not deep, not for lack of strength, but of soil. Stone came quick, and shovels bent if you pushed too hard. So you worked with what you had. A spade, a back willing to fold, a quiet rhythm to the digging. 1 scoop, 2, breath, repeat. And when it was ready, it was nothing more than a notch in the earth, lined with sticks if they had time, covered with planks if they had extra. Most didn't. There was no seat. You crouched, and you prayed, not out loud, but deep in the ribs, that your balance held, that the wind didn't shift, that no creature had wandered in before you, because the pit, though made by people, belonged to more than just them. Flies came first, then worms, then things that made noise at night, but never showed their faces. It was never clean, but it was theirs, a space carved from necessity. Children learned young to avoid it at dusk, not because of ghosts, because of snakes, because of slips. One wrong step, and the earth gave way. And if it rained, it didn't just smell, it oozed. But even then, no one complained. You dug another, next to the last, and carried on. It became routine. Every few months, fill in the old, mark it with a stone, start a new one 3 paces east. And over the years, the land became patchwork, soft in places, sour in spring, but familiar. Sometimes they grew things nearby, turnips, beans, crops that asked little and gave just enough, because waste fed soil. And in that, there was a strange redemption, a cycle no one taught, but everyone learned, from father to son, from mother to earth. And still, no one talked about it. You didn't mention the pit, not at meals, not at weddings, not when courting, especially not then. But you noticed things. A girl with clean shoes was wealthy. A man who built a roof over his pit was wise. A family who shared theirs, well, they were either kind or cursed. In winter, the pits froze, hard as sorrow, but quieter. Steam rose from the surface at dawn, a signal, a warning, a breath that wasn't yours. And in those months, people stepped faster. No lingering, no thinking, just finish and flee, because the cold did something strange to the smell. It sharpened it, made it brittle, cut through wool like a blade. In summer, it was worse. The heat didn't just stink, it clung, You could feel it rising before you saw. The flies, thick, alive. And yet, even then, it wasn't hated. Not truly. It was work. It was function. It was something you could control in a world where most things weren't. Rain? You couldn't stop it. Crop failure? Couldn't prevent it. But the pit? That was yours. To dig, to fill, to bury. There was pride in that. Even if it didn't show. Some built frames, hung cloth for privacy, planted herbs nearby to confuse the air. Lavender, if they had it, more often mint. And once, a rosebush, though it didn't last the frost. The pit became part of the family. Rhythm. After supper, before bed, after birth, before death. Every stage of life ended there, quietly. And in a strange way, it held memory. You could stand beside it and trace years. This was the year of the bad rains. This one was dug when grandfather died. This one we had to move after the cow fell in. They laughed sometimes. They had to, because if you couldn't laugh near the pit, you'd cry. And crying wasted salt. So they joked. Called it the reading room. Hung old scraps on the post like books. But still, no one forgot its place. It was the final stop. The quiet truth. And when someone left, when they died or married or wandered off, the pit was part of the leaving. Emptied, filled, smoothed, erased, but never forgotten. Because the earth remembered. In softness, in scent, in the way grass grew different there, even years later. And in that memory, there was honor, not loud, but settled. Because when a family lives close to the earth, they know what goes into it. And they know, eventually, they'll join it. And that brings you as to the stranger beliefs, to the whispers passed down behind hands, to the idea that waste wasn't just waste. That's something someone might be listening. Let's follow that into the dark, where superstition and sanitation meet. They said sickness had a smell, not a symptom. A scent, something sharp and foul, like onions left too long. Something sweet, but wrong, like fruit rotting in a locked room. It lingered where death had visited, or where it planned to return. And for centuries, people believed the nose knew best. The miasma, they called it. Bad air. Air thick with filth, sin, and sorrow. Air that rose from waste pits and latrines, from damp walls and unwashed sheets. To breathe, it was to invite disease. To live beside, it was to grow weak. And to sleep near it was to gamble with your soul. So they took precautions. They held flowers beneath their noses, carried herbs in satchels, hung garlands in windows, and crushed lavender between their fingers before bed. They burned pine, bathed in vinegar, scrubbed their walls with salt and prayer, and they avoided the latrine when they could, or held their breath, or went quickly without speaking. But the irony was sharper than the smell, because sometimes the very place they feared became the place they turned to for healing. It began with observation. Leeches and worms thrived in filth, and yet they didn't die. They moved freely through waste, through decay, through rot, and seemed stronger for it. So some wondered, was there strength in the soil? They began to collect things, sludge from the bottom of pits, water darkened by waste, clay stained by runoff. They mixed it with wine, with ash, with honey when they had it, and they applied it to wounds, to rashes, to swellings that wouldn't go down. Everywhere, not openly, but enough for word to spread. They called it earthy balm, or peasant's poultice, or worse when it failed. But when it worked, or seemed to, it became ritual. A scrape on the knee, a bit of pit water, just a drop, a stubborn cough. Breathe in the steam from waste-boiled herbs. And when fever came, the kind that glowed. Beneath the skin, they turned to leeches, collected from the muck, black, slick things that pulsed with promise. Clamped to skin, left to drink. The theory was simple. Sickness lived in blood. So take the blood, let it out. Replace the foul with the pure. They bled the sick, the weak, sometimes the perfectly healthy, just to be sure. And though many died, some lived. And that, in those days, was enough. They trusted the process, even when it hurt, even when it stank, even when it meant crouching beside a pit and praying for strength. Because hope, like waste, finds a way to survive. In some places, they believe illness could be frightened away. A loud noise near the latrine, a chant spoken backward while throwing salt into the pit. Others swore by silence, entering barefoot, leaving with eyes closed, not speaking of what they felt while squatting over the dark, because the pit wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a mouth that took, yes, but also whispered back. In dreams, in fevers, in the quiet between chores, one healer swore she cured gout with warmed privy clay. Another claimed to read futures in the pattern of mold along the latrine wall. People laughed, then tried it themselves, because when nothing else worked, you turned to what you had, and what they had was dirt, foul, familiar, and endless. Children were taught the rules. Step with the left foot first. Don't. Whistle near the pit. Never use the same rag twice. These weren't laws. But everyone followed them. And slowly, the latrine became more than a burden. It became a part of healing, of superstition, of daily life. They swept it clean, not just for health, but for luck. They lit candles on its edge, left offerings, crusts of bread, bits of meat, sprigs of thyme. And when someone fell ill, they checked the pit. Had it changed? Had it overflowed? Was it trying to tell them something? Because deep down they knew the body and the earth were mirrors. And when one was sick, the other showed it, not in words, but in scent, in color, in silence that hung too heavy in the air. Even priests began to take notice. Not officially, but in small ways. A cross carved above the door, a blessing muttered during construction, holy water sprinkled near the base. Because waste, for all its filth, was part of the divine cycle. From feast to flush, from mouth to earth. And it was foolish to pretend otherwise. So they watched. They waited. They adapted. And somewhere in the midst of the smell and the sickness and the superstition, they found balance. Not comfort, but understanding. That even the worst of places can offer something. Even filth can heal. Even darkness can carry wisdom, if you listen softly. And that brings us to a quieter place, not cleaner, but more controlled. Where monks walked in silence, where ritual met reality, and where even the holiest had to find a place to go. Let's step into the cloister, where the wind hums through stone, and the latrine is part of the prayer. It was said that monks spoke little, and in many ways that was true. Their days were filled with silence, not the silence of absence, but the presence of quiet intention. But even among sacred walls, with scripture carved in stone and candles flickering like breath, the body did not forget itself. Monks ate, monks drank, and monks, inevitably, had to go. The cloister smelled of beeswax and old vellum, of herbs dried in linen sacks, and robes hung to air beneath the rafters. But behind the gardens, beyond the kitchen, past the hedges pruned into psalms, there was another smell. Faint, earthy, persistent. The drain, built not in haste, but with quiet care. A channel carved into stone, narrow, hidden, sloped with intent. Water flowed through it from a cistern above, or from the rainfall, carefully caught and kept for holy things. and necessary ones. It led to the reredorer. A word, as gentle as it could be, for a room that housed the latrines. The monks did not speak of it, but they visited it, daily, in silence, each according to the hour. Their habits were folded high, their sandals set to the side. There were no doors, only archways. Privacy was found in focus, not walls. The benches were stone, smooth from centuries of use, and below them water moved. A soft trickle, like the whisper of scripture through a cracked window. Some believed that if the soul was clean, then the body should follow. Not indulgently, but with reverence. So they cleaned, with cloths rinsed in vinegar, with buckets passed, hand to hand, filled from the same well that bathed their altar linens. The monks knew the rhythm of waste. They knew who rose early, who lingered, who returned more than once, but they never spoke of it. They nodded, lowered their eyes, listened to the soft cough of another entering. Not judgment, just awareness. Even waste had a place in their order, and when illness came, they did not panic. They boiled water, added lavender and thyme, scrubbed the reredorer with stiff brushes made from bramble. They read from Psalms as they cleaned, not because they feared punishment, but because they understood balance. Even saints sweat, even scribes had bowels, even the holiest hands were washed daily of what could not be avoided. Some monks found contemplation there. A brief moment, seated in silence, looking at the garden through the open arch, breathing, not in prayer, just in presence. The drain ran beneath the garden, feeding the soil, invisible but constant. And the herbs that grew, chamomile, sage, pennyroyal, were said to thrive, not in spite of the waste, but because of it. It was all part of the cycle. The feast days, the fasts, the privy visits between vesper and matins, and always the drain, moving gently through the stone, carrying away what was no longer needed. No one built statues to it, but it kept the monastery clean, holy even, because true sanctity didn't come from pretending the body didn't need. It came from honoring what the body did, quietly, carefully, without shame. When winter came, the water slowed. The monks added straw along the channel, broke ice with wooden rods, warmed the stone seats with cloths laid early by the brother. On duty. It was not luxury. It was grace. And sometimes visitors would ask, where did it all go? The monks would smile, gesture to the garden, to the drain, to the fig tree that bore sweet fruit every autumn, its roots deep and blessed buried. Truth, and in that there was a kind of humility, a reminder that everything returns. That waste, too, belongs, that even in silence, the body speaks. And that brings us from sacred walls to stone towers. From monks to men-at-arms, from gardens fed by drains, to castles that tried and failed to master their own waste. Let's walk there next, up winding stairs, past iron-bound doors, to a place where gravity did the work, and someone else caught what fell. From the outside, castles seemed invincible, all stone and shadow, towering over hills like they'd grown. From the rock itself, unbothered by weather, war, or waste. But inside, beneath the banners, behind the thick tapestries and polished suits of armor, things flowed, downward, because what went in had to come out. And even kings had to go. They built garderobes, the noble name for a toilet. Not a room, exactly. A stone alcove set into a wall, tucked between stairwells or behind bedchambers, sometimes barely wider than your shoulders. A seat, if you were lucky. A hole, always, and beneath it, air, if it was well designed. A pit, if it wasn't. Sometimes just the outer wall, where waste could fall freely into the moat, or worse, into the courtyard, Dot it depended on the builder. And the budget. Dot there were no pipes, only gravity. And faith. Dot faith that what dropped would not linger, would not freeze halfway down, would not splash back up in the wrong season. Servants knew better. They were the ones who checked, who leaned out windows with torches to see where the chute led, who tossed buckets of water or vinegar down to freshen the flow. Some systems worked. Most didn single quotes t. Too many sharp turns, too narrow a shaft, too little thought for what happens when things pile up and don't move. So they invented solutions. A bucket on a rope, a long stick with a cloth-wrapped end, a squire with a strong stomach, and no better prospects. The waste didn't always fall clean. Winds shifted, stone chipped, and once memorably, a court jester dropped a lute down the wrong hole and spent 3 hours fishing it back with a hook and a prayer. It became a kind of game. Which chute clogged most often? Which one froze first? Which poor soul would be assigned to unclog the royal shaft before breakfast? The moat didn't help. Yes, it was wide. Yes, it was deep. But it wasn't moving. And castles weren't built for scent. So when wind curled wrong through the slits in the tower walls, it brought more than chill. It brought a reminder that no matter how high the stone, it all came back around. Knights complained. Lords turned up their noses. But still, they used the chute. Better than a chamber pot, they reasoned, which had to be emptied by someone, somewhere. And always, that someone was lower down the ladder. The squire, the page, the one who arrived eager and left with stains. No soap could lift. They carried buckets through hallways, past nobles who turned their heads, past cooks who hissed and pointed them to the back door. They dumped it beyond the walls, into trenches, into gardens meant for flowers, not food. And if it was winter, they chipped away the frozen crust, layer by layer, like peeling bark from a tree that didn't want to let go. The irony was, castles had baths, rooms with steam, and stone and perfumed oils, rooms with carved lion heads and brass spouts that trickled water onto weary shoulders. But none of that reached the waist shaft. Because plumbing wasn't about elegance. It was about acceptance. The understanding that every wall, no matter how tall, has a shadow. And in that shadow, something drips. Some castles tried to innovate. They built chutes with curves, added small grates, hung bundles of herbs near the opening, not to stop the smell, but to suggest someone had tried. They carved runoff channels, built little platforms below to catch the worst of it. But the rain didn't always fall when needed, and servants didn't always catch what fell. Accidents happened. A guest mistook the garderobe for a storage nook. A noble's ring slipped and was never seen again. A rat, bold and hungry, crept up the wrong way and startled the duchess into song. But still, they used them because the alternative was worse. Chamber pots that filled too fast, privies in courtyards that froze shut, and the unspoken shame of being seen with a full bucket. The garderobe, for all its flaws, was private, and privacy was power. They hung cloaks there, truly, not just for space, but for scent, because the air in the chute, strange as it was, repelled moths. And in a world where fabric was priceless, moths were the greater evil. So garments hung above the hole, absorbing the air, repelling the insects. And some whispered, gaining a smell that lingered longer than wear ever could. You could tell a castle cloak by its weight, and sometimes by its scent. The garderobe became more than a toilet. It was a place of pause, of reflection, of relief, in more ways than one, and though few would admit it, it was the only place in the castle where you are almost always alone. No expectations, no commands, just stone and cold and silence. And what came after? And that brings us to the daily rhythm. To the boots that trudged each day from chute to pit. To the one who didn't sit on the seat, but stood beneath it. Let's follow their footsteps, past the gates, through the mud. To where the waste was caught, carried, and forgotten. He rose before the bells. Not because he wanted to, because the job didn't wait. His boots were stiff with dried mud and worse. Pulled on in the dark with a grunt and a prayer. A prayer not for luck, but for tolerance. They called him a gong farmer. The name sounded foreign, almost noble. But it was neither dot. It meant he cleaned what others left behind. By hand, by bucket. By dusk, when the smell soaked through to bone dot, his home was small. One room, window facing away from town. Not out of shame, just practical. The wind carried less that way. He drank cold water. Ate bread left over from the night before. Wrapped a scarf soaked in vinegar around his face. And began. The first. Stop was the inn. Always the inn. Full buckets. Fuller than they should have been. Drunks missed or didn't care. He knocked once. No answer. He didn't need one. The alley behind the inn was slick with more than ale. He poured carefully, so the slosh wouldn't reach his boots. But it did. It always did. Next, the baker. Clean folk. Their waist smelled of yeast and onions. Almost pleasant, until it wasn't. He scraped their chute with a bent spade. A rhythm he knew by heart. 3 strokes, turn. 3 strokes, lift. Then. The manner. More buckets. Heavier. They ate well. Which meant he worked harder. Sometimes he found scraps in their waist. Half a pear. A bit of meat. He never ate it. But he noticed. He noticed everything. Which homes had sick smells. Which had sour. Which were full of lavender and lies. He moved like muscle memory. Like breath. The cart creaked behind him. A patchwork thing. Wood nailed to wood. A wheel that moaned louder than it rolled. The villagers stepped aside. Not out of respect. Out of necessity. Children stared. Dogs sniffed, then backed away. Even cats watched from distance. He didn't. Mind. He preferred the silence. The dump site was just beyond the wall. A pit lined with stone, where waste was left to settle and sink. He poured slowly. Each bucket a chapter in a book no one read. A story told in smell, weight, and color. He wiped his hands on straw, tied the scarf tighter, and returned. The cycle didn't pause. Not for weather, not for feast days, not for death. He worked through. It all. Rain made things worse. Everything ran. Sun baked the smell into his sleeves. And winter froze it. Made the buckets slosh like jelly. Made his hands crack until they bled. Still, he worked. No one thanked him. But they noticed when he missed a day because the street filled. The smell rose. And then, and only then, they remembered who he was. He didn't resent them. He understood people needed forgetting to survive, but he remembered them. All of them. The butcher who offered him broth when no one watched. The widow who left. A coin on her bucket lid. The child who once said thank you. Just once, in a whisper. That was enough. He ate his meal at dusk. Alone in the corner of his home. A stew made for whatever was cheap. A crust of bread, tough but warm. And then sometimes a drink. Not for joy. Not for escape. Just to still the smell in his throat. To drown the part of him that remembered too much. He washed his hands 3 times. Once in water. Once in ash. Once in silence. The smell never left. But it softened. And when he laid down on straw that itched and creaked, he did not dream. Dreams were for people who didn't know what. Waste felt like between their fingers. But sometimes he hoped. Not for a better job. just for a morning when the first bucket was lighter, when the wind blew east, when the scarf stayed dry. Small hopes. Real ones, because even among waste, there's dignity. Even in filth, there's rhythm. And in a life spent hauling the world's worst, there's a kind of strange peace. He kept the town clean, unseen, unpraised, unforgotten, at least by the streets. And the next morning, he rose again. Boots stiff, scarf damp, hands steady, because the job didn't wait. And neither did the waste. And that brings us to war. To the siege. To the moment when the toilet wasn't just relief. It became a weapon. Let's watch what happens when the smell becomes a strategy. It began with silence. The kind that hangs over city walls like a held breath. The kind that comes before arrows, before fire, before sound becomes something sharp. Sieges were slow. Not like battles, quick, loud, and bloody. Sieges starved you first, dried you out, weighted you down to nothing. But inside the walls, people learned to adapt, to stretch food, to gather rain, to ration breath. And when stones ran out, and oil was gone, and arrows were too precious to waste, they turned to what they had. Waste. Not as burden, as weapon, because what left the body didn't have to leave the fight. It started with chamber pots. Porcelain, ceramic, copper when you were lucky, but even luck cracks when dropped from a tower. A scream, a splash, and the enemy learned that standing too close to the walls came with its own dangers. Buckets followed, then barrels. Ropes lowered over parapets with slop swaying like a threat. The kind of thing no soldier wants in his beard, or his boots, or his open mouth when shouting orders. And still, the waste came, sometimes mixed with sand, to thicken the blow, sometimes laced with ash or lime, to burn, because pain was strategy. But humiliation? That was art. A well-timed dump could scatter a ladder crew, could make a battering ram pause, could turn morale into nausea. It wasn't noble, but it worked. And in the cold logic of war, that's all that mattered. Siege journals, those that survive, speak of foul rains and piss storms, of days when the air turned brown and the walls dripped, of nights retreating, not from sword or arrow, but from something worse. Latrines were emptied with intent, not hidden, but hoisted, pointed, aimed. And when words failed, defenders hurled what they'd saved. Not gold, not fire, but the contents of a week's meals, spent and sour. The enemy learned to keep distance, learned to cover their faces, learned to burn their clothes when the worst of it hit. But the lesson was always late, because waste, once flung, does not ask permission. It does not miss. It finds cracks in armor, soft places, open mouths, and it lingers. In cloth, in hair, in memory. No song was ever sung for the ones who thought of it first, the ones who looked into a full bucket and saw a possibility. But they changed the field. They turned need into tactic, refuse into resistance. And the stink of it became part of the siege, not just physical, psychological. A line drawn in filth, saying, "We will not lose cleanly. We will not surrender dry." Defenders smirked as they poured, as they aimed, as they heard the enemy retch and stumble and curse the gods that made digestion. And it wasn't only the defenders. Attackers, too, found use for waste. They'd fling diseased corpses over the walls, rats in sacks, rotting food laced with filth, left near wells, because sickness was cheaper than swords, and faster than famine. In this way, the siege became a cycle. What went out came back in. What you flung away might return with teeth. Even in retreat, they left gifts. Pits filled to bursting. tunnels dug with waste instead of water. Traps meant not to kill, but to disgust. Victory sometimes smelled worse than defeat, and when it was over, when the gates opened and the enemy had gone, the people didn't cheer. Not right away. They scrubbed. They burned clothes. They prayed near the latrines and sprinkled herbs on every floor, because the stink of war doesn't leave when the arrows do. It sinks into mortar. It waits in shoes. But they lived. They stood on walls that dripped with things no one spoke of. They survived on air too thick to breathe. They turned the lowest thing into the highest point of strategy. And in doing so, they proved something simple and strange, that even filth has a place in courage. Even the bucket has its moment of glory. And sometimes the foulest act is the most human one. So the next time someone speaks of honor, of chivalry and swords drawn in the sun, remember, someone threw a bucket, and someone ducked, and someone won because of it. And that brings us away from walls, away from war. To something quieter. To the small hands of children, carrying things no child should carry, because the job didn't care about age, only about what was full, and who was small enough to fetch it. He was small, which helped. Small hands, small steps, small voice, that made it easier to send him through the narrow door, down the alley, to the pit or the ditch, or the edge of the wall where things were meant to disappear, because the chamber pot was full, and someone had to empty it, and he wasn't old enough to say no. They handed it to him with a nod. No words, no gloves, just a quiet expectation. He wrapped a cloth around the rim, held it close, walked carefully, because to spill it, to bring the smell back home on his shoes or tunic, was worse than doing the task itself. Sometimes it was warm, sometimes cold, always heavy, too heavy. He had to stop once or twice, catch his breath, rest it on a wall just for a moment, and watch the steam rise like a warning. No one offered to help. Even other children looked away, because everyone had their job, and his was to carry the bucket. He didn't remember when it started. Only that one morning he was asked. And the next, expected. There were no lessons. No gentle hand on the shoulder explaining why. Only the bucket. Only the path past the butcher. Past the dogs that sniffed and turned. Past the man who always spat when he saw him coming. He didn't hate the work, but he hated the smell, and how it clung, even after scrubbing. Even after rain. At night, he pressed straw against his skin, trying to scrape it away. It didn't work, but it made him feel like he was trying. Sometimes he dropped it, not often, but once was enough. The splash was worse than the fall. The look on his mother's face, the sharp words, the cloth soaked in vinegar thrust into his hands. He scrubbed the stones where it landed, knew the spot would never smell clean again, knew he'd be the one to walk past it each day. The next time, he tied rope around the pot, strapped it to a stick, tried to balance it like the older boys did when carrying water. It worked, until the pot cracked. And then there was nothing to carry, and a house that stank until someone found a replacement. But they didn't stop asking him, didn't stop handing him the full one, each morning, each evening, even when his back ached, even when he coughed from holding his breath too long, because work was work, and children were workers. They fetched, they scrubbed, they learned to walk, with eyes down and mouths closed. Some of the other children bragged about how far they carried theirs, about who had the worst smell, about the time someone dropped one on a lord's doorstep and ran. Laughter, sharp and brief, like a break in the fog. But he didn't laugh. Not often. Because each day was the same. Pot, alley, pit, return, a rhythm as sure as breathing. And when he was lucky, When the road was dry and the wind behind him, he'd finish before sunrise, before the streets filled, before the looks came, before the whispers, because even among the poor there were ranks, and chamber pot boys stood at the bottom. He sometimes wondered what they did with it, the waste, where it went after the pit. What happened to the thing he carried so carefully? He never asked. He just walked home. Hands wiped on straw, eyes blinking against the early sun, heart already bracing for the next trip. And yet there was something steady in it, something oddly proud, because the house stayed cleaner, the floor stayed dry, the mother sighed less, and he knew no one else would do it. No one else could be asked. It was his job. And jobs mattered, even the smallest ones, especially the smallest ones. And that brings us to the hearth, to the food that made the pot full, to the meal, quiet and plain, that moved from hand to mouth to waist. Let's sit there for a while and watch what went in and what came out. It began with bread. Always bread. Rough and dark, made from rye, barley, or whatever grain hadn't gone moldy in storage. Sometimes with bits of stone still in the flour, ground too fine, too fast, by millstones worn smooth by age and rain. Teeth broke on it. Stomachs did their best. They ate it with onion, if they had it. Cheese, if it hadn't turned. A bit of salted fish, if it was a feast day. And stew. Always stew. The pot never emptied. They just added to it roots, cabbage, the odd bone. A stale crust soaked back into softness. It filled you, and soon after, it emptied you. What went in dictated what came out, and the privy knew. You could tell. A man's meal by the scent of the whole, by the color, by how long it lingered. Some foods passed gently, others did not. Lentils caused trouble, as did beans, though they filled the belly better than most. Dried peas were the worst. Hard going in, harder coming out. They knew this, and still they ate them. Because hunger didn't negotiate. The wealthy ate better. Yes, more meat, more butter, more spice to disguise the spoil. But their privies suffered too. Too much fat, too much salt. Servants knew. They cleaned after, scrubbed the stone, scattered lime. A nobleman with bad digestion became a kind of legend, known not for his sword, but for the scorch left behind. And yet, everyone ate. Everyone excreted. No one escaped the cycle. A good meal meant a good day, but it also meant a full pot by night. A reminder that satisfaction comes with consequence. Even the monks felt it. Their fasts were gentle, their stews simple. But after feast days, especially saints' days, the latrines hummed with life. You could track the calendar by the smell. The peasants, too, understood this balance. Too much onion led to pain. Too little bread meant nothing moved at all. They didn't have words like digestion. They had rhythm, a sense. They knew the days to stay near home, knew the herbs to chew to settle the belly. Mint for gas, charcoal for sourness, wormwood for whatever else. They passed this knowledge down, mother to daughter, father to child, not in books, but in bowls. A meal wasn't just fuel. It was memory. It was medicine. And the privy? That was the test. Some designed their seats differently. Wider holes for feast seasons. Buckets beneath for days when travel wasn't safe. A lord once ordered a padded seat, cloth wrapped in wool, perfumed with rose. It lasted 3 days. Then mold crept in. Lesson learned. They used straw, wool scraps. Sometimes moss. Soft when dry, terrible when not. What passed through the mouth became a story on the floor, a mark of life, of survival. And in some households, the privy became part of the kitchen, not physically, But spiritually, the meal determined the labor. And labor was constant. Even the animals played a part. Pigs devoured scraps. Dogs licked bowls clean. Chickens scratched through leavings for worms. What humans didn't finish, the yard did. And still, the chamber pots filled. Some houses lined their pots with cloth, easier to clean. But harder to carry. Others poured them nightly. A task as sure as firewood in prayer. And when the family sat for supper, they didn't speak of it. But it was there, in the choices they made, in what they ate, and how fast, and with what fear, because spoiled meat meant a long night. Bad water meant weeks of pain. They watched each other closely. Who chewed too slow, who excused themselves early, who went too long without going at all. Illness began at the table, and often ended at the pit. But there was laughter, too. At the uncle who belched too loud, at the cousin who blamed the stew for his morning dash, because humor lives where shame does, and the body, for all its troubles, is honest. Even in the darkest room, even over the deepest pit. And so the meal continued, night after night. Bread, stew, onion, repeat, a cycle as steady as breath. And with it came the knowing. What we eat, we answer for. Not in theory, not in philosophy. But in the simple act of going. And that brings us beneath the bridges, where meals ended, not in homes, but above heads, where waste met wind and lives were lived underneath it all. Let's walk there next, quietly, carefully, because what drips does not always warn. The bridge arched like a spine across the city, stone worn smoothed by, wheels and weather, strong, silent, carrying feet, carts, and secrets. But beneath it, another world. Shadows lived there, and not the dangerous kind, the forgotten kind, the kind that cooked in corners and slept in doorways, that whispered rather than begged. They didn't choose to live under the bridge. No one did. They were pushed there by cost, by loss, by walls already full. But they made do, strung cloth between beams, laid stones for fire circles, hung lanterns that smoked more than they glowed, and above them, people relieved themselves. The bridge, grand as it was, held more than travelers. It held garderobe, little wooden boxes, cantilevered over the edge. Just enough privacy to squat and sigh. Just enough height to believe your waist had disappeared. But it didn't. It fell. Slow, sure, silent, a drip, a splash, a splotch that darkened the dirt and made you step sideways without thinking. Those below learned the rhythm. They knew which stalls were used in the morning, which creaked after supper, which belonged to the tavern on the corner, the worst of them. They built lean-tos with sloped roofs, hung scraps of oilcloth overhead, kept buckets to catch what couldn't be avoided. It was constant, like weather, but warmer and thicker. They burned herbs when they had them, wore layers not for warmth, but for protection. And still it seeped through, clothes stiff with stain, shoes that squelched when dry, blankets too rank to keep near the face, but it was shelter. Stone above, stone below. A place out of the rain. And in a world where rent meant hunger, and hunger meant silence, they took what they could. Vendors sometimes set up shop on the edges, selling candles, bones, baskets, quick to pack up when the drip grew worse. Children played nearby until the day one slipped and didn't laugh. After that, they stayed closer to the wall. No one lived beneath the center. That was the danger zone. Directly under the chutes, not marked, but known. Even cats avoided it. Even rats walked the perimeter. The worst was summer, when the sun warmed. The stone and the heat coaxed every scent into bloom. You could taste it in the air, feel it behind your teeth. A sourness that lingered longer than any meal. They tried things. Buckets of ash. Charcoal hung in cloth. One woman painted the beams with vinegar every day until her hands cracked, and her patients did too. But nothing held it back, because it wasn't just filth. It was people living above, unseeing, uncaring, dropping what they no longer needed, never wondering where it landed. Sometimes it was more than waste. A broken shoe. An apple core. Once, a book it landed spine first on a boy's head. He cried. Then read it became his pillow, then his plate, then a thing he sold for bread. Because even under the worst, you found ways to live to adapt, to laugh, to say, watch your head, with a grin and at night, when the city slept, the bridge creaked not from weight. From memory the slow echo of boots overhead, of barrels rolling, of voices arguing above the splash and beneath it all, the people listened, wrapped in cloth, bent in corners, waiting for morning, for dry air, for a little kindness if the gods were generous. But mostly, they waited for it to stop never did. And so they endured, because the bridge, for all its filth, was also shelter and when the winds rose, and the river grew wild, and the landlord banged on doors up top, the bridge never asked for coin, only silence, and a little space between the drips and that brings us to the throne, not the royal kind, but the kind you didn't want to sit on in winter. Let's go there next, where dignity met design, and warmth came in short supply. They called it a throne, not with irony, with intent. A wooden chair, carved and polished, topped with velvet or cushion, curved just enough to seem regal. But beneath it, a hole and beneath the hole, a bucket, or a chute, or a servant waiting with clenched teeth and steady hands. Because even queens had to go. They tried to make it graceful. Screens were arranged just so. Incense burned nearby. A lady in waiting stood ready with scented cloth. But no amount of rosewater masked reality. And no title made the task less human. The close stool, they called it, an elegant name. A disguised chair. A box with a lid lined with pewter or tin, sometimes porcelain. It followed her from castle to castle, carried like treasure, handled like glass. It was emptied by a groom of the stool, a title both prestigious and pitiful. He held the chamber. Pot he wiped when needed. He whispered advice between tasks, because if you're already kneeling beside royalty, you might as well counsel her too. Some became confidants, trusted, listened to. Others simply scrubbed, then bowed, then left. The smell followed them out, soft at first, then bold. Even among perfumed halls and marbled floors, you couldn't escape it. Not entirely. There were moments. A banquet paused, a sermon delayed, because the queen had a stomach, and it had made itself known. Musicians played louder. Windows were flung open. Lavender was scattered. And still, it lingered. They tried plumbing, pipes carved into stone, chutes angled steep, gravity employed like a servant that never spoke. But water was scarce, and pressure weaker than pride. So things stayed, coated walls, settled in bends. And once, famously, backed up. An ambassador from the north never forgot that visit. His boots didn't either. The palace blamed a cracked pipe. The servant blamed a feast. No one blamed the queen. She merely raised an eyebrow and changed castles a week later. Cleaners followed. Men with buckets, brushes, and no illusions. They whispered about the royal diet. Too rich, too strange, too frequent. But they whispered with care, because servants could vanish, like smells in wind, or into walls that didn't answer back. Royalty, for all its finery, didn't escape the cycle. They merely delayed it, disguised it, wrapped it in velvet and protocol. But the body has no patience for pageantry. A king once excused himself from council 3 times in an hour. The scribe noted it in margins. A footnote of flesh amidst politics of steel. And the stool remained, moved, polished, admired, until opened. It was part of the bedroom, part of the wardrobe, part of the truth no portrait ever painted, that no one painted the royal flush. Because it wasn't a flush. It was a dump, a lift, a pour, and someone else did it. They called it service, called it sacred, called it what they had to make it bearable. But it was what it was. A bucket, a hole, a duty. And for all the tapestries, for all the harpists and chandeliers, it came back to that chair. Sometimes it creaked, sometimes it cracked. Once it collapsed entirely, and the seamstress who designed its silk cover was never seen again. But another stool appeared, and the cycle resumed, because the throne must remain, and it must empty, and someone must bear the smell. The castle kept records, not of waste, but of who emptied it, of who stood closest, of who said nothing when there. Eyes watered. Those were the loyal ones, the true servants. They were given extra bread, or boots, or sometimes just silence, which, in that world, was its own reward. And when the royal body grew ill, the stool told first, the color, the weight, the smell that no herb could hide. Doctors poked it with sticks, described it in scrolls, built treatments around its texture. And still, the queen sat. Still, the bucket filled. Still, the servant bowed. Because royalty doesn't stop going, only changes who watches. And that brings us to winter. To the months when everything slowed, when waste turned to ice, and need pressed harder than comfort. Let's walk there now, to the pit in frost, to the breath that steamed in silence, to the moment when even going became pain. It started with a sound, a crack, soft as dry bread breaking, then another, then silence. The pit had frozen, not just stiff solid, like a pond, like something dead holding its breath. And suddenly, everything stopped, because when waste no longer flowed, when the privy no longer gave way, people hesitated. They stood in doorways, bucket in hand, breath fogging the air, and wondered, where would it go now? The winter hadn't crept in. It had crashed down, over rooftops, into boots, through straw-packed walls. Fires were never enough. They warmed your fingers, not your core. And so the waste stayed, congealed, stacked, layered. One day, blurred into the next. A slow crawl of snow, of frozen bedsheets, of boots too stiff to bend. People adapted, because they had to. Some carried pots further, to rivers choked with ice, and dumped them through cracks with whispered apologies. Others dug new pits in ground too hard to yield. Axes met frost, spades chipped stone, and what fell in froze instantly. They called them winter graves, not for the dead, but for everything the body gave up in spite of the cold. Latrines, once rank, now hummed with silence. The smell was gone, the air clean, sharp, but it wasn't peace. Just pause, because stillness doesn't mean safe. You could slip, fall, land in places you shouldn't. A boy once did. The frost had formed a lid, thin, deceitful. He stepped on it, and the ground gave way. He was pulled out, but the smell never left him. Even in spring. So they built paths, laid boards, lit candles not just for light, but for warmth, even a flicker. Some brought coals into the privy. A dangerous gamble. More than one seat caught fire. But numb flesh did worse. There were stories of people stuck, frozen to the bench, of skin torn away by wood, colder than steel. They wrapped rags around themselves, piled furs behind them. Learn it? To go fast, and not look down. Winter didn't care who you were. The Lord's garderobe froze like the beggar's bucket, and waste became equalizer. A duchess once refused to use her close stool. Said it felt like squatting over a grave. She held it in for 2 days and nearly died. Her maid, wiser, dug a hole by the fire and whispered prayers as steam rose from the dirt. Because when the air burns your nose and your own breath turns against you, there's no time for ceremony. The waste had to go, and it had to go somewhere. So they waited for thaw, watched icicles drip from rooftops, listened for the pit to groan, to crack, to yield. And when it did, when the crust broke and the smell returned, they wept. Not in horror, in relief, because movement meant survival, because rot meant life, because the worst had passed, for now. But winter remembered. The ground stayed soft in strange ways. Certain corners refused to dry. The stain of those cold months never quite lifted. People avoided the path behind the mill, avoided the slope near the chapel, places where waste had waited, silently, patiently, until it could flow again. And yet, they endured. They learned to see waste not as shame, but as proof. Proof that they had eaten, had lived, had outlasted the frost. Spring came with birdsong and sour mud. A thaw that uncovered more than just earth. Chamber pots once buried were dug up. Privies refilled. The rhythm resumed. And with it, a strange kind of pride. Because to survive the freeze, to go on going, even when nothing moved, was no small thing. It was resilience. Worn on the soles of boots, etched in the grain of wooden seats. So the next time the air turned sharp, they lit fires earlier, dug deeper, prayed less for miracles and more for thaw. And that brings us to the edge of sense, to the stories told in whispers, of spirits in the waste, of curses passed through privy smoke. Let's walk there, where superstition soaked into the straw, and no one entered the latrine without looking back. They didn't speak of them during the day, only at night, when the fire burned low, when shadows crawled up the walls and the wind whistled through the cracks. The ghosts, not the grand ones, not lords with swords or ladies with poisoned rings. These ghosts were quieter, fouler, born of waste, not war. They lived in the privies, in the pits, in the spaces beneath the floorboards, the ones no one checked after dark. Children were told, don't look down too long. Don't speak near the hole. Don't laugh in the latrine. Laughter attracted them. So did pride. And stepping in without knocking 3 times. Some said they were spirits of the unburied. Others claimed they were demons, drawn to places where sin and filth were too tightly woven to tell apart. But most agreed something was there. The signs were clear. A sudden gust of cold air when no wind stirred. A shiver in the spine as you bent to relieve yourself. A whisper just below hearing when no one else was near. Privies creaked more than they should. Buckets tipped without reason. Flames refused to light if the spirit didn't want you near. So they left offerings. A coin flicked into the pit. A sprig of rosemary hung by the door. A rhyme muttered under breath. Leave me be, I'll leave you clean. Let no shadow pass between. Some kept bits of iron in their pocket. Some drew circles with salt. Some simply held their breath and counted to 10. Because fear doesn't need proof, only memory. And they remembered the girl who disappeared, stepped into the privy one winter night, and never stepped out. Her shoes were found beside the door, her shawl on the hook. But the pit, still, undisturbed, as if it had never been touched. They said she spoke too loudly, mocked the rules, laughed at the rhyme. No one laughed after that. Old women claimed they heard the ghosts breathe, low and wet, not like lungs, like something deeper, like the earth itself, exhaling. Men told tales in taverns, of hands reaching up, of eyes in the dark, of being pulled down with a force that wasn't strength, but hunger. And yet, they kept going, because the need remained, because the body doesn't fear the dark, only the mind does. Still, they changed their habits. No one used the privy at midnight. Even the bravest waited for dawn. If they had to go, they went in pairs. One watched, one waited. Both silent. In monasteries, the rerid order was blessed each season. Holy water flung into the darkness. Candles burned until nothing moved. In manors, servants crossed themselves before cleaning, and never reached in with bare hands. In cities, stories spread of a rat that spoke in a dead man's voice, of a stone that bled when scrubbed too hard, of a child born with the stink of the pit and no shadow at all. No one believed every story, but everyone believed at least one, because everyone had felt it. That moment of stillness, that breath held too long, that knowing you weren't alone. And yet, they endured. They whispered, but they endured. They hummed songs while walking down the path. They kept lanterns burning longer than needed. And when someone died, someone unloved, unclaimed, they watched the privy pit closely, because ghosts like quiet places. And nothing is quieter than a hole full of everything left behind. So they kept the area clean as they could. They spoke gently near the door. They thanked the air when it didn't stir. And they taught their children the same, not because they were sure, because they weren't. And uncertainty is the root of all superstition. The fear that maybe, just maybe, the waste wasn't the only thing that stayed behind. And that brings us to the final step. Not a ghost, but a weight, something heavy, carried day after day, lifted not just with arms, but with dignity. Let's follow it now. One last time. It didn't look like much. A wooden bucket, bound with iron, cracked at the rim. The kind you might carry water in, or grain. But this wasn't water, and it wasn't grain. It was everything people didn't want. Everything they cast off. Everything they pretended disappeared the moment they turned away. And it was heavy, not just from weight, from heat, from smell, from knowing what it was. They say a bucket is easy to carry if you hold it close. But this one you held away. From the body, arms stretched, back bent, eyes ahead, because to feel it slosh against your legs was a failure. Because to stumble meant shame, not yours, but shared. The bucket dripped, always, through wood grain, through cracks filled with wax that never quite held. People walked around the man who carried it, not because they disrespected him, because they couldn't face him, because it reminded them someone had to carry what they left behind. He walked carefully, measured steps, no swinging, no haste. Each foot placed with intent. It wasn't just skill, it was ritual. Every step was a prayer. Let it stay in. Let it not spill. Let the road be clear. And when it wasn't, when the road was slick, when the dog barked, when a child ran too close, he gripped tighter, because dignity, once spilled, couldn't be scooped back up. He learned to listen, to the sound of the slosh, to the shift in weight as the contents settled, to the rhythm of the day. At dawn, the bucket was light. By dusk, it was a world. He never filled it himself, only collected. From doorways, from corners, from beneath stairs, where servants left it without meeting his eyes. He never asked questions. He just lifted. And in that lifting, he carried more than waste. He carried their diet, their illness, their secrets. He knew who was sick before the doctor did. knew who had guests by how fast the pot filled, knew whose child was teething by the sudden stench of spoiled milk. The bucket told stories. Not with words, with weight. He bore them all. His arms ached by midday, his knees stiff by nightfall, but he did not complain. Not because he didn't hurt, because there was no one to hear it. And somehow, that made the pain cleaner. He didn't mind the stink. Not anymore. He minded the stares, the pity disguised as politeness, the way people turned up their collars when he passed. But never once, not once, did they offer to take the bucket. He had dreams sometimes of dropping it, of walking away, of leaving the full pail on a nobleman's step and knocking just once before running. But dreams were soft. The bucket was not. He couldn't afford dreams. He could barely afford gloves. So he worked every day, in frost and fog, in heat that made the bucket sweat. He grew strong, but never proud, because pride had weight too, and he had no hands left to carry it. At night, he'd wash his arms in ash water, scrub until the skin burned, not to clean, to prove he still could feel something, because numbness was the enemy, not the waste. Numbness made you spill, made you careless, and the bucket forgave nothing. Sometimes he'd look at it, empty, drying near the fire, and think, this carried more than a cart ever could. This carried the truth of everyone who thought they were above it. It carried their bodies, their meals, their fears, and somehow it still stood, still waited to be filled, still accepted everything without question. So he did too. And that brings us to the end, not of the job, but of the walk, the last step, where the bucket is poured, and the weight is gone. Not forgotten, not erased. Just put down. For now, some stories are too quiet to echo. They don't live in parchment or stained glass. They don't hang in museums or sing from rooftops. They live in places we don't look, and in people we don't name. People who knelt beside pits, who walked with buckets, who scrubbed stone no one else would touch. People who carried the weight of waste so the world could walk above it. And there is dignity in that. Not the kind carved in marble, but the kind you feel in your ribs when someone holds your gaze and doesn't flinch, because dirt is not disgrace. It's what the world is made of, and what we all return to. They lived with it, knew its moods, knew the way filth could freeze, the way steam rose from a trench like a warning, the way a bad smell meant someone had lived, eaten, survived, and someone else would carry what remained. It was a kind of faith, not in gods, but in routine. Step, lift, pour, repeat, a sacred rhythm, carried not by priests, but by peasants, by servants, by children who learned early that the body gives and the body takes, and someone must stand in the middle. And they did, quietly, daily, without applause. They understood things others had forgotten. That survival doesn't smell like rosewater. That grace can live in calloused hands. That the truest labor is the one no one sees, because when it's done well, there's nothing left to notice. They walked in filth, but held their heads. Steady, not proud, but not ashamed either, because they knew something deep and unspoken. Every clean room begins in a dirty one. Every comfort stands on someone else's work. And every feast ends with someone emptying the pot. So tonight, we remember them. Not as shadows, but as anchors, the ones who held the town together. Not with words, but with shovels, with boots, with patience. And maybe we've moved on. Modern drains, flush handles, rooms that spray perfume with each press of a button. But beneath the tile, beneath the steel, beneath the scent of citrus and bleach, the same work happens. Still dirty, still necessary, still worthy. And still, someone carries the bucket. So the next time you light a candle, or step barefoot across a warm, dry floor. Think of them: the medieval toilet cleaner, the gong farmer, the chamber pot boy, the servant with vinegar cloth, and bent spine, not to pity, but to honor